Becky Nicky. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 24, which is nutrition. I'm basically going to skim Chapter 24. You may be instructed that there are more items that you need to know for your test, so please talk to your instructor. I always like to start with a bunch of definitions. So here we have several. What is a nutrient? Any substance that promotes normal growth, maintenance, and repair. An essential nutrient. This is one that we cannot synthesize inside the body. We'll see in just a second. We'll talk about some minerals and we'll talk about some vitamins that cannot be synthesized by us. We must consume them in our food. The third category there, non-essential nutrients. These can be made by the body. There are several amino acids that we can, remember we have a protein, and we break that protein down into individual amino acids. We can take one amino acid and tweak it to make it another amino acid. So that would be one that we don't have to consume in our food to have it, but we do need to consume food in order to make it from the products of our food. So a lot of people don't like the word non-essential. You still have to eat food. So the last two are really just telling you what are the major human nutrients. What are the 6 things that we need to survive? Carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins are the main 3, and we're going to talk about those in detail. But basically, if you remember from when we started back in 201, we said that you have the 4 biomolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Well, here are these 3 of the 4 coming back. So carbohydrates for food like glucose, lipids, fats, proteins we need for enzymes in order for many of our biological functions to occur. What are some other human nutrients that we have to have? We have to have vitamins. We've seen some of these vitamins in action. You should have talked about vitamin D throughout the semester. You should have also talked about vitamin K when you did blood clotting. We'll come back and talk about some more of those. And then minerals. Some of the ions that we've been talking about: magnesium, calcium, iron, iodine, several of these that we need, potassium, sodium, I don't know if I mentioned those, minerals that we need for our physiological function. And then they always say, technically speaking, water. So think back about, I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, chapter 2 or 3 back in 201. If you remember the word dehydration synthesis or hydrolysis. Hydrolysis means break with water. You have to have water to take a large polymer and break it down into individual monomers. So poly meaning many, mono meaning one. So if I have a large protein and I want to split it into individual amino acids, I have to have water to be able to do that. There are several different My Pyramids or healthy eating charts. Your book also has a plate where it shows the different sections of what you should consume and the portions of that. I liked this one because it shows the person walking up the stairs. I like the fact that it's saying it doesn't matter what you eat in a roundabout way. It doesn't matter what you eat. You have to exercise. So, of course, we want to eat the right proportions of everything, but you still have to exercise if you want to maintain a healthy lifestyle. This one I like as well because I think it's interesting that we're pretty flipped here in the United States. So look at the top section of this pyramid. We have white rice, white bread, pasta, potatoes, sweets. That's the teeny tiny part. And then we have milk and cheese. Then we have fish. Then we have chicken. So the top 3 sections that we're supposed to consume the smallest amount of those, it's flipped, right? We consume those in the largest quantities. Most of us don't consume 2 to 3 servings of fruit every day or vegetables in abundance. They're the afterthought, right? So it's just kind of interesting here in the United States. It might be why we have an obesity problem, because we eat everything off the top half of this food chart. Okay. So on to carbohydrates. Not that I'm a glowing example of nutrition, right? I try my best. We can't always do. Sometimes we want a piece of chocolate cake, but for the most part, we should be trying. Okay, so carbohydrates. I don't normally have numbers for you to look at. I just put this up here because it's the recommended daily allowance for carbohydrates. It says 130 grams per day. If you eat a Big Mac and a large fry, that's it. That's 130 grams. So if you consume a Big Mac and a large fry, you're done for the carbohydrates for the day. And every food almost has carbohydrates in it. What are carbohydrates? Glucose, fructose, milk sugar, which is galactose. So everything that we consume has a carbohydrate in it of some sort. So The first listing there says starch. What is a starch? A starch is a complex carbohydrate. So it's many glucoses linked in such a way that they kind of form a sheet. They're a little harder to break down. So grains, vegetables. Then we have sugars. We have fruit sugars, which I said is fructose. There's a chart coming up in just a second. Milk sugar, which is lactose, and then we know glucose, body sugar. So why do we care about carbohydrates? So by now, especially if you had me and I've drilled cellular respiration forever, you should know that, let me see if I can get this pen working quickly. Alright, so if I have glucose plus oxygen, I'm going to turn it into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. If you don't know this equation by now, you need to be able to write it out. If you want to write out the glucose, I just have a bad habit of always writing glucose because most people look at C6H12O6 and they don't know what that is. So usually we know O2 is oxygen. So if you want to write it out all in the chemical formula, you can. But basically, you have to have glucose. Glucose is your brain's food source. Your brain likes glucose exclusively. It doesn't want to have to use fats to produce ATP. It's much easier, much more quick to use glucose. So neurons use glucose almost exclusively. Red blood cells use glucose. And I'll put this last point in here because I want to make sure we're tying everything that we've learned this whole semester back together. So excess glucose is converted to what? So hopefully you know if we take glucose and you have too much of it, you're going to turn it into glycogen. And where are you going to store glycogen? This is in the liver. Now go back to chapter 16, those pesky endocrine hormones, right? How do these relate to glucose and glycogen? Do we remember? I'm running off the page here. Glucagon and insulin. What does glucagon do? Glucagon breaks glycogen down into glucose. So if you don't have enough glucose in your bloodstream, we go ahead and release glucagon from the pancreas. Glucagon tells glycogen in the liver to break down into glucose, and then that glucose gets released into your bloodstream. So again, everything is tied together in this, particularly in 202. Alrighty, here we go. So this was just to kind of give you an idea. All of these are carbohydrates. So there's sucrose. Sucrose is like table sugar. If you take glucose and fructose and put it together, you get sucrose. So maltose, wheat, I usually think of like wheat sugar. Lactose, which is milk sugar. Regular glucose. And it's showing you the equation or the end result of respiration, right? CO2, water, and energy. That energy is ATP, right? Alright, so what happens if you have too much glucose? We just said you store it as glycogen in your liver. Okay, we got that. Well, what happens if you have too much in your bloodstream, too much for your liver to store? What do you do with the extra glucose? Well, some of it can also be turned into fat. So we have the word there, lipogenesis. You should be able to look at that and figure out what it is. Creating lipids. So basically, if you're just consuming Big Mac after Big Mac, once your stores are full, we're going to turn everything else into fat. Okay, next category, lipids. So we did carbohydrates, we're going to do lipids, and then we'll talk about proteins. So what are some of the dietary sources of lipids? Where do we get lipids from? And we think of fats, right? Well, I've numbered these because there's many different types of lipids. So I just want to make it clear the three that I'm going to talk about, so I have them numbered. So the first one there, triglycerides. I have a picture coming up, so if this doesn't make a lot of sense, just hold on for a second. There's saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So saturated, think of something that's solid. So butter, here it says meat, dairy foods. Unsaturated, think of something that's usually a liquid. So your corn oils, canola oils, sunflower oils, anything that's a nut and seed oil derivative, it's usually unsaturated fat. So let me show you the picture, then we'll come back and talk about cholesterol for a second. So this is from a different book. This is from a biology book, but there's something similar in your textbook. Basically, if you look at the top one, it says unsaturated. And hopefully you can see that we're missing hydrogens here. Go down to the saturated. Every single carbon has a hydrogen on it. So what happens in a saturated fat is everybody kind of lines up and forms these sticks, which is why it's real easy to form a solid. But what else would be bad about solids that you consume in your food that are traveling around in your bloodstream after your intestines reabsorb the fat? Well, these things can become clogged, right? So it's not such a great thing. So why are unsaturated fats a little bit better? Well, you can see the hydrogens are missing, so it forms these wavy tails, or kink tails as they like to call it. They don't form solids as readily, so therefore they won't really stick. Let's go back and just read the statement that we had about, if I can get there. There we go. Cholesterol. The majority of your cholesterol is made by your liver. So about 85% of your cholesterol is produced by the liver. So basically, if you're consuming food that's high in cholesterol, your liver's already at the 85% mark. You're just adding to that. Again, if you have too much cholesterol, too much fat, eventually it's going to be in your plasma and as you're trying to get rid of it, and you're going to have some, again, clogging of the arteries, making your blood more viscous, which we know is not a good idea, right? So, but we need to look at where cholesterol is important. And hopefully you remember this picture from way back in 201 again. I know I keep referring to 201, but at this point it should all be coming together in a big picture. So these here, not a good color. These guys right here, these are all of your cholesterols. If you remember, cholesterols get wedged into your plasma membrane. This, hopefully, let me go back, let me make sure. This is our phospholipid bilayer. This is extracellular fluid. This is intracellular fluid. This is my cell. So remember, one of the necessities of life, or to call something living, it had to have a boundary. That boundary for us is the phospholipid bilayer. So it separates the outside environment from the internal or inside environment. These cholesterols help with rigidity, or they help keep the wall steady. They also stop water from just leaking out anyway, in or out. And if you talked about aquaporins, you can go back and look at that. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. Basically, we're offering some stability by wedging some cholesterols in there. Why did I mention aquaporins? Why did I mention water? What's the relationship between fats and water? They don't like each other, right? So if you have oil in water, it spreads, right? It doesn't want to form or mix with the water. It's the same thing with these tails, right? These tails don't like water. They're hydrophobic, which is why they stick together, which is why we have a cell membrane. Okay, I'm sure I've gone way off track, and you're like, oh, Miss Nikki, stop. So I'll stop. Let's go back to, this is where we left off, right? Cholesterol in egg yolks, meats, shellfish, milk products. Again, if you consume too much, not good for you. Alright, so we talked about saturated, unsaturated. We talked about our phospholipid bilayer and our cholesterol. Well, you can see right here the word phospholipid. That's the third type of phospholipid the third type of lipid that I want to talk about is called a phospholipid. So, number 3 there, phospholipids are essential in what? You have to have phospholipids in order to have a cell membrane. If you don't have a cell membrane, you don't have life. So we should get that. Okay, so now to the overall. We talked about the 3 types of lipids. Let's talk about what do we do with these lipids. Why do we have to have lipids? Why do we care? So essentially, what's your body going to do with lipids? Number 1, highlighted in red there, it's going to help absorb fat-soluble molecules, specifically called vitamins. I'll get it out. We'll see vitamins in just a second, but certain vitamins have to attach to fat before they can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Some of the other, we have to have them for phospholipids, we have to have them for cell membrane. That's pretty critical, right? What happens with adipose tissue? Where did we find adipose tissue back in Checker 4 when we did histology in 201? Around your organs, right? Hopefully when you did digestion, you talked about some of the fatty pockets or draping of fat. So what is it going to do? Provide cushion for your body organs. It's going to offer an insulating layer beneath the skin. Remember our hypodermis in our integumentary system? To It's also a concentrated source of energy. What did I say when we talked about carbohydrates? If you are done breaking down, if you don't have any more glucose, you're done breaking down glycogen into glucose, and you're out, what do you do next? You start breaking down fat. So it is an extra energy source for us. And then stabilizes membranes. That goes back to the phospholipid comment that I made. So basically, we ingest lipids, our liver sorts it out and puts together the type of lipids that we need. So we do need triglycerides. We haven't talked about lipoproteins, but it is a lipid and a protein. I'll stop just quickly in case some instructors like to talk about this, and if you're going into the health field, you're going to see HDLs and LDLs. HDL is high density lipoprotein. This is low density lipoprotein. Basically, HDLs are good and LDLs are bad. Basically, a high density lipid is going to carry lipids to the liver to be broken down and gotten rid of or excreted, where low density lipids are not. So usually if you go and have a blood screen done, they'll look at your ratio of high density lipids to low density lipids. If you have a lot of high density lipids, that's good. That means you're taking fat molecules and excreting them out of the body. If you have low density lipids, you're bringing those lipids to the tissues to try to build more, and that's not always what we want. Sometimes we consume too many lipids, and then we're forced to store that lipid somewhere. So if you want to read up about that, there's a great couple of paragraphs in your book. Fatty acids, cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol we have to wedge into our plasma membrane, and phospholipids we have to use to create plasma membranes. And remember, cells don't live forever. You have to break down cells, and then you have to create new cells. So hopefully at some point you talked about mitosis, the copying of a cell. Maybe you talked about apoptosis back in 201, or programmed cell death. So our cells are constantly dying or being told to self-destruct, and we're constantly rebuilding. So we always need a new supply of phospholipids to make cell membranes. Okay, we're finally on to category 3, proteins, right? Okay, where can you find proteins? Eggs, milk, fish, most meats contain what they call complete proteins. The reason they call them complete is they're saying they have every single thing that you would need to make all of your essential amino acids. So we can break down these components into their simplest form, rearrange them, and make any amino acid that we need. And hopefully, I've said this a couple times, but I just want to make sure, when we have a protein, what is it? It's a bunch of amino acids. This is amino acid 1, amino acid 2, amino acid 3. They're all linked together to make a protein. So if you consume just legumes, nuts, and cereals, so pretty much beans, nuts, and cereals, you don't have all the components there in order to make every amino acid. If you consume individually, if you consumed just beans, it's not going to do you any good. If you consume just nuts, if you consume just cereals, they're talking like wheat, right? But if you consume beans and cereals, so beans and some sort of rice or wheat together, then you have the ability to make every single amino acid. So I love the comment in your book, especially in countries where meat products are not readily available. So not that, either fish or poultry or actual meat. If they don't have that much, what do you always have in the diet? You always have beans and rice. Okay, so what do we use proteins for? We talked about how we get them in the food. Why are they important? Well, keratin. Ooh, geez, hopefully we remember this. What is keratin related to? Skin, right? What about collagen? Skin too. Hopefully we remember our keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, that waterproofing on the outside of our skin. What about elastin? Also, we have elastin in our skin. What about muscle proteins? Do we remember myosin and actin? So what happens if we're lifting weights? We have to make more proteins, right? Well, where do we get the building blocks to make more actin and myosin? We have to consume the food, break it down, and then build up the muscles that we want with the proteins that we want. So So it says most functional molecules, enzymes, and some hormones. So basically focus on the enzymes. We've talked about these quite extensively, hopefully, throughout 201 and 202. The enzymes, they are proteins with a job, right? Proteins with a specific job. Sorry, pen slipped there. Sucrase is an enzyme that breaks down sucrose, which is a sugar. So proteins with a specific job. Again, I'm going back to cellular respiration, making ATP. There are several enzymes that we have to have in order for ATP to be generated from glucose. If you don't have those enzymes, cellular respiration doesn't happen. If cellular respiration doesn't happen, you don't have any ATP. If you don't have any ATP, pretty much you die, right? And if you're one of my students, I'm sure you'll think that's funny because I've said that a million times this semester. Okay, on to vitamins. So we did carbohydrates, we did lipids, we did proteins. We'll talk about vitamins, and we'll talk about minerals. And then I'm not going to go back and talk about water, which was the 6th item. Basically, they're organic compounds. So organic means they have carbon in them. That's it. They're crucial in helping the body use nutrients. They're usually called coenzymes. So when you see coenzymes, it really just means helper. That's what I think of. So without the vitamin, remember how proteins have to be folded in a specific way in order for them to do a job. To be an enzyme and do a job, the protein has to be folded. Well, sometimes vitamins will bind, and that binding will cause the protein to fold and become active, is what they like to call it. So they call these coenzymes, meaning if that vitamin isn't present, that protein can't do its job. So vitamin D, B, K are all synthesized in the body. Here are some fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. So meaning you have to have fat in order for vitamin A, D, E, and K to be absorbed into the body. So think of the retina, your eyes need vitamin A in order to work properly. What's vitamin D? Calcium absorption, right? When did you see vitamin K? You should remember that from clotting. Vitamin E here really helps with antioxidants. Getting rid of unwanted charged molecules in the body. Vitamin C, this is going to have to do with skin, collagen. Vitamin B, critical in cellular respiration. There are several vitamin B complexes that are coenzymes that if they're not present, the cellular respiration enzymes can't do their job. So very, very important. All right, what about minerals? We're not going to look at all of these, but some of these right off the bat, you should be able to tell me after this semester what they're important for. So minerals, most of the time I usually think of ions when I think of minerals. So here is calcium, so we know this has something to do with bones. So does phosphorus. Remember that hydroxyapatite? That's the calcium phosphate. Potassium, hopefully after muscle and nervous cell transmission, we know potassium is important for your resting membrane potential, right? What about sodium? That's also important for your resting membrane potential, right? Sodium has to be on the outside, potassium has to be on the inside. Magnesium helps with neuron transmission. We may not have talked about this, but magnesium again helps neurons communicate more rapidly with each other. Iron, hopefully we think red blood cells. What about iodine? We should think of T3 and T4. Go back and look at your endocrine chapter. You can't make T3 and T4 without iodine, correct? Okay. The interesting thing, though, is that you do have to be careful. Can we just load up on as many minerals as we want? No. There has to be an uptake and an excretion, so you want to keep it in balance. If you have too many minerals and you're not excreting them at a normal or regular interval, you're going to have them build up and they can become toxic. So you can't overload, basically. Okay, so we've talked about carbohydrates. carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, let's talk about metabolism and basically just understand these isms. So metabolism is any bioreaction or biochemical reaction that's happening inside the body. So anytime I put things together or break things apart within the body, that is your metabolism. So there's two types of reactions. There's anabolism, and this is the synthesis of large molecules from small ones. So let's put that into A plus B, right? So if I have A and I have B and I want to turn it into this molecule, that's called anabolism. Think of building. Catabolism, I always think of cut. Hydrolysis, break with water, complex structures. So if I have this complex structure and I want to break it down into simpler ones, that would be this equation. So catabolism is to cut or break down, anabolism is to build up. And then basically, what is cellular respiration? Cellular respiration is catabolism, right? We're taking glucose and we're breaking it down into simpler components. Basically, when I write ATP, your book is saying energy. So hopefully you know we're taking the energy out of glucose and we're storing it in ATP. You don't make ATP, you take the energy out of glucose and you stick it onto ATP, and then that ATP can go anywhere in the body and be broken down and release energy. So ATP is more of the vessel for transferring energy throughout the body. I put this chart in here just so you could see the different stages at which proteins and fats and carbohydrates enter into cellular respiration. If you would like to learn more, feel free to look through the book. I don't make my students know all 4 steps of cellular respiration. I would rather have you understand the basic concept. This is cellular respiration, right? All 4 steps here, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see proteins can come and enter this part, or this part, and very infrequently. Fats, where can they enter in cellular respiration? There's several points here. Basically, you put food in, we go through this process, and you get ATP out. Now, might there be some other things you get out? Yes, you get lipids that you might want to use to build phospholipids or cholesterol. You're going to get sugar that you're going to store. You're going to get proteins that you're going to break down into amino acids. But basically, when we talk about metabolism, food in, energy out is basically what you should get. I guess I should also mention how many ATPs. Some teachers like that. 36 ATPs is the estimate. Some say 36 to 38 ATPs from one glucose molecule. And again, when we consume something that's a starch, it has hundreds of glucose molecules, but just one will give us 36 ATPs. There's some other definitions in here that I think I should just mention. What's energy balance? Most of these make sense. Energy balance, balance between the food that you intake and the energy that you put out, that's your energy balance. So you're eating food, energy intake, you're breaking it down, and then whatever energy you're expending. So bond energy released from food must equal total energy output. What happens if you don't consume enough food, but you're working out constantly? You're going to lose weight, right? You're going to break down your fat stores. What happens if you eat too much food and you're sitting on the sofa? What happens to the food that you eat? It gets stored for use later because you're not expending any energy. So to me, that seems pretty basic that we can think about that. There is a really interesting focus section. It's 2 pages in your book. I want to say 492, 93, somewhere in that neighborhood. Where it's focused on obesity, and it goes through some really interesting ideas and some of the different surgeries that are available, some of the different diet plans. I suggest you just look at it, look over it, and read it. There's a way to kind of factor your obesity level, and they do this what's called body mass index, or BMI, and pretty much they take your weight times your height, and then you get a number. And if your number is between 25 and 30, you're considered overweight. If your number is over 30, then you're obese. I've seen some new websites where you can enter your pants size and your height, and then it'll tell you what your BMI is. So I don't know if I really believe some of those sites, so be careful if you go looking for a BMI calculator. You should be measuring something and then entering that. And again, why do we care about this? What happens if your body mass index is too high? So we've seen a direct correlation between high BMI and a higher incidence of all of these. Atherosclerosis, plaque buildup in your vessels, right? Diabetes, insensitivity to insulin, hypertension, heart disease, osteoarthritis. So definitely a higher incidence of these diseases and correlating to a higher BMI. Another word, BMR, basal metabolic rate. Basically, this just reflects the energy the body needs to perform essential activities. And we'll hear people say, oh, I have a really high metabolic rate, right? So, ooh, what did I do? Back here. It doesn't want to let me write. I better get it fixed before the next slide. Okay. Basically, if somebody has a high metabolic rate, so they're consuming food and they're burning through it very quickly, right? Not just because of physical activity, but because of their normal bodily functions. This could be genetic, right? So if you're consuming food but you have a high metabolic rate, you're not storing fat, right? So you're not going to have that reserve. And you could also start breaking down other tissues in order to provide you with energy. What happens if you have a really low metabolic rate? So your body is not burning the food that you're consuming fast enough, even if you are exercising. So if you have a low metabolic rate, that means you're going to store more fat on your body, and then that can lead to some of the same issues that when we saw a higher rate of BMI and how that led to heart disease and other issues. So, excuse me. So just two words that you should be familiar with, basal metabolic rate and BMI. Hope I can get the pen because I don't want to have to try to do puppets to explain this to you. So let's see. No, we don't want to work, right? No. Shoot. I have no idea what I did. Let's go back. No, back. I see it says end of slide. Okay. I'm going to behave now, right? It keeps switching to end of slide. Okay, it's not going to let me write. So, basically, what would you have, starvation diets, what are they doing for you? Well, let's start with carbohydrates. So, let's say you limit your carbohydrate intake, so Atkins diet, right? If you aren't consuming carbohydrates, short term it's okay, right? You're not consuming carbohydrates. What are you going to do? You're going to break down fats, right? So you're going to start breaking down fats. What happens if you don't have a lot of fat and you go on a carbohydrate-free diet? So you have no carbs for energy. And remember, your brain likes glucose. So if you're starving your brain, it's probably not good for your brain. But okay, so low glucose, low fat. You don't have a lot of fat. The next thing you start breaking down are proteins. Where do we have proteins? Muscle. Do we want to start breaking down our muscle tissue in order to have proteins in order for the rest of our organs to survive? No, we don't. They call it tissue wasting. So I would say for a short period of time, reducing your carbohydrate load, seeing how most of us eat many more carbohydrates than are necessary, initially it's not that bad. But you also have to remember you're taxing your liver and your kidneys a lot more as well. So your liver has to process all those fats that are being broken down. Remember we said the liver has a lot to do with bringing in those high-density lipids and breaking them down and getting rid of them for excretion. So your liver's working overtime if you're on a low-carbohydrate, high-protein, high-fat diet. Again, what happens if you're doing just protein? So I know there's been some diets where it's like, eat all the bacon you want, but just don't eat any sugar. Well, again, that's not good for your kidneys because urea is a component of the breakdown of proteins. So basically, if you're consuming many, many proteins, your kidneys are having to work extra hard as all of this product comes in, and your kidneys have to turn it into urea and kick it out through excretion. So basically these starvation diets, they're taxing some of your excretory functions and your liver as well. And then the last thing was eating disorders up here. There really isn't anything in the book, but I did want to just mention it. Most people have heard of anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia, you're not consuming food, you're pretty much starving yourself. So this goes hand in hand with the starvation diet that I was just talking about. We've all seen the picture of somebody who's anorexic and they're down to skin and bones, basically. I mean, they're under 80 pounds. Why is this bad? Well, obviously, you're not getting the nutrition that you need. So your brain is not working properly because it doesn't have glucose. You're not insulating your organs as well because you don't have any fat. And then the muscles that you did have, you broke them down to get the protein out of them so that you can still live. So you have tissue wasting. You don't have a lot of muscle. And remember, go back to 201. What do muscles do for you? Remember, muscles stabilize joints. So if you don't have that muscle there to help stabilize the joint, what happens to your joints? They don't work as well, and you can have slippage. That's not good. Proteins, aren't ligaments proteins? Yes, they are. If you're holding bone to bone together with a ligament, that's protein. What if we start breaking those down? Again, if you're not getting the minerals that you need, you're going to leach them out of your bones. So you have osteoporosis setting in. So what about bulimia? Bulimia is where you consume food, but then you're regurgitating, you're vomiting up all of this food at a later date. So you binge eat and then you purge it because you don't want to feel full or you don't want to gain weight. This can lead to many other types of issues, right? Go back to when we talked about throwing up your stomach acid content, and that stomach acid content would normally be put into your bloodstream, and that would help regulate your pH. So we said there's respiratory alkalosis if you have vomiting quite regularly. Not only, so it's messing with your pH, which is messing with your pH is messing with the enzymes that are in your blood plasma, that what do those enzymes need? They need a specific pH in order to function and to carry out your physiological tasks. Also, you'll see that people that have bulimia, it starts eroding away the enamel on their teeth, constantly having that hydrochloric acid. And usually there's low potassium. So at the same time that you're vomiting, you're also bringing up hydrochloric acid, but you're also bringing up potassium as well. And remember, potassium has to do with setting your resting membrane potential on the inside of a cell. So if your resting membrane potential isn't right, this can affect your mental activity, nervous cell transmission, muscle transmission, all of those things. So overall, none of those are great things. So that's it for the lecture. I'm sorry the pen didn't work, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the semester. See you later. Bye.